Hey everyone, welcome back to the B-Movie Bunker. Today we're looking at 2013's The House at the End of Time, brought to us by Alejandro Hidalgo. This one comes from Venezuela. So it is in Spanish, and it will be subtitled, which means you gotta do some of that there reading. What we have is the story of Dulce. Dulce lives in a house with her husband and her children, and something bad happens in the house, which ends up locking up Dulce for 30 years. Her husband is murdered, her son disappears, is presumed murdered, and she spends 30 years in prison, and then she is released basically under house arrest back in the house where all these bad things happened, which that in and of itself seems kind of odd, but getting past that is pretty easy, because what we have here is actually a really interesting story. It's hard to call this one just horror. I don't really think it's horror. It's more of a thriller, kind of a sci-fi bent kind of thriller, but I guess it has some horror-like elements with the house. Now, I will say the story, it is disjointed, and that is intentional, is telling the story flashbacks as well as what is happening with Dulce now 30 years later, and then going back to her family and back and forth, and it's going back and forth like that, and it actually is needed for the story that is being told. The movie actually starts in very familiar territory with, what she wakes up and her face is cut, and she's trying to find her son in the house, and there's all these noises and stuff, and it starts in that very familiar territory of what you expect to be just another haunted house type movie, but it changes course pretty quickly. I don't want to spoil things, so I'm going to try to limit what I say about what actually happens. I will say that the film is it packs a lot of emotion, I think. It really sets an interesting tone, and it really kind of shows, you see the character of Dulce and the love she feels for her child, for her children, and the toll that the last 30 years had taken on her when she comes back to this house, and the trouble she's having now being back in the house. I think the acting is phenomenal, which you do lose some with it being in a foreign language, because you can't pick up on some of the things unless you speak that language fluently. I speak un poco Spanish, but it's still conveyed very, very well. And I think the house itself is just a beautiful setting. And by beautiful, I mean it's beautifully chosen for this film. It's got a very dark and foreboding appearance to it, while still appearing to be, an actual house for the most part. This is obviously Venezuela, so their houses, might be a bit different than what we're used to here stateside. This is obviously an older house as well that has been around a long, long time. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a long trip, a long journey, and there are things that happen on a journey that sometimes can't be explained, or sometimes things that you would want to change. If you could go back and change those things that happened, and or do something differently, maybe don't take that off ramp, take the next one. And that's kind of how this film feels, is that it feels like that long trip, and you're waiting for that payoff, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting, and it definitely builds and builds and builds, and I think you get a decent payoff at the end. I like the way it ended. I like the movie in general. I think it was very well written. I think it was wonderfully directed, and the sounds and the music chosen, I think, is absolutely incredible. This is definitely one that I would have never known. It was apparently a smash hit in Venezuela, but the typical American audience doesn't catch on to a lot of stuff like that, and I'm glad this one did, and I kind of hope they don't do a horrible U.S. remake of it. Although the one possibility is that if they do, it might lead more people to seeing the original. So that's all I've got for this one. Till next time, stay safe out there in the wasteland, folks.